So in the last video, we looked at how we can access the data on this text file and then print it out. And if we run this here, we can see that we've used .readline to output several lines of data. But what if we wanted to actually find the person who had the highest score? We need to isolate this data after the comma, the second column if you like. So this solution gets us some way to actually isolating this second column of data. So I've got a variable here called line 1a, and I've used .readline to put the first line of data in this text file into this variable. And if I run that, you can see here that I'm printing that and it has output this here. Now, look at this second one. I've got a new variable, line 1b, and we're assigning the value that we've already assigned here, but we're using this command, .split. Okay, now don't get confused. We used .strip in the previous tutorial to remove carriage returns. That's that invisible character that creates a new line in a text file. So we're not using .strip, we're using .split, and we're splitting on the commas. So it's .split with speech marks and a comma. That's what it's looking for, and that's what it's stripping. And what it's done is basically turned this line of data, whereas previously we were just printing out this text. Now we've got it inside a list, which gives us a bit more control. And that control has allowed us to print out just the second element. So as you know from lists, from previous tutorials, that this is the first element which has an index of 0, and this is the second element which has an index of 1. So when I print out the name of the list and in square brackets 1, it prints out this data here. Now you can see in this example that the carriage return that I was talking about earlier is still saved in there, and we're going to have to use .strip to get rid of that at some point. But let's just recap what's happened so far. So we've got a constant. We've assigned it the contents of this text file, and then we've used .readline to assign the first line in that text file to a variable. And then we've printed that variable just so we can see what's going on. Okay, then we've used .split to look what we've just saved in that first line and turn it into a list, which we can see printed here. And that allows us then to isolate that data, that score data in the second element with an index of 1. And we've printed out this. Okay, first challenge. Can you please print out the first name of the player and their score? And you have to make it say player name and then the user's name and then their subheading score and then the value for their score. So hopefully you came up with something like this. So I've got a variable that reads the first line in the text file, so Tilly57, and then I've got a new variable where I'm using .split to turn that line of data into a list, and then that allows me to use some string here and then output the first element in the list, which is Tilly, and then another print statement which outputs a subheading score and the next element in the list, which is their game score. And we're decomposing here the problem. So now we have isolated 57 into its own value. We can start to think about comparing the different elements in the list to find out who's got the highest score. Now, one step we need to do before that is how could we print out player name and score for every person in the list. And just as a little clue, this is how we ran the program before, allowing us to use a for loop to iterate through every line in the text file. So this is the kind of output that you are looking for. So pause the video now and see if you can produce this output. So hopefully you came up with something that looked a bit like this. So obviously we've got our gamescores.txt, which is being opened in read-only and assigned to the myFile constant. And then we are using that constant in our for loop, and it will iterate through each line in the text file. So, and on each line, so on the first iteration, the first loop, Tilly, 57 has been assigned to line. And then line is updated here so that it splits. We're using that dot split command, and that turns that Tilly.57, that Tilly, 57 into a list. So dot split turns it into a list with an index for each of those values separated by commas. So that means I can now print the name and print the score with the headings like we did before. And if I run that program, you can see that it has output the correct data. And now we're one step closer to actually comparing the values in this indexed. Okay, next challenge. Can you please update your for loop so that it outputs that the winner is, and then the person's name and their score. So this is string, this is a variable, this is more string, and this is another variable. And your for loop should iterate through every person in the gamescores.txt and then to find who the person with the highest score is. Okay, so pause the video and let's see if you can do this challenge. So this is one way that you could solve this problem, and you've got the for loop, which I'm sure you're familiar with by now, and we are splitting so that each time it looks at a line, it's looking at it in the form of a list. And instead of printing out the name and the score, I'm now assigning them to a variable. So the variable name and the variable score, that will change each time it loops. Now, while it's in the loop, it's going to look at the current value for score. And if the high score is, if score is greater than the high score, it updates the value for high score. So high score has an initial value of 0, and that is an integer. Okay. Now at the same time, while it's still in that loop, it's then going to take the name that's currently saved and assign it to winner. So we've also got a variable for winner defined before the for loop starts, and these are sort of basically waiting to be used. So when we look at this list, on the first loop, Tilly gets saved into name, and the score Tilly got 57 gets saved into score. So it then goes, right, is score 57 greater than high score? Well, high score is set to 0 at the beginning, so yes, Tilly is now assigned to winner. But then the iteration carries on, so we're on the second loop. So Anna gets saved into name and 93 gets saved into score. So 93 is higher than 57, so the new value for high score becomes 93, and then the winner's name gets assigned Anna, and then it loops again. So then Eleanor is in is the person being looked at, so Eleanor and 34. Now 34 is not as high as 93, so high score is not updated on this particular loop. So you're getting the idea, and it loops through the process. But one thing you may well have encountered if I run this program is I'm getting an error on line 8, and it's saying there's a problem between string and integer. Okay, so why is there a problem with this integer? Well, we've got here that it splits and it assigns, say, Tilly 57. So Tilly goes to here and 57 goes to here. Now, I was slightly confused by that because if you do a simple test, so I've got a list here with 2 integers in it, and if I add them together using the list index, that actually works. Okay, so the solution is to cast to integer. Okay, so if I run that, then it now works. So, but why is this a string value? Okay, so what Python does is when it splits, even if it's a number, it assigns it as a string value. So what is being saved in score on this particular loop is not the value 47, it is the value 47 in speech marks, and that is why you have to cast to integer. Okay, so we're nearly there, and this is basically a working solution. Just remember, when you dot split, it will cast number values to integer, so you will need to convert them to integer if you're comparing them like this. Now, we could actually do this in a slightly more efficient way, and I am going to show you this now because actually it's really useful in a sort of busy exam situation. There is a very quick way where you can just make everything assign to a variable, and you can do it all in one line. So I'm going to move this if statement out of the way slightly, and instead of having 3 lines to split and then assign to variables, we can do it in 1 line. So the first thing you do is you, using commas, assign variables, and it might be like the example I'm giving you is quite a simple one, but it might be that you'll be working with a text file that has loads of other values all on one line, so it might be that you need more than 2 variables here. Let's keep it simple for now. So I'm now going to assign all in one line those values to the variables. So all you need to do, instead of using 3 lines, is you put your variables and then you split on the comma, and it will automatically assign the first column in the text file to name and the second column in the text file to score. Now we are back to this problem where we have a string value saved into score, so you do have to update the value of score to an integer value, but that then works. Okay, so we're nearly done. But my last challenge for you is, can you search through the data stored in GameScore by name and find a person? So this is the kind of output we're looking for. So if I enter the player name Tilly, we want it to output their score. Now, spoiler alert, how are you going to fix it so it is not case sensitive? So pause the game, see if you can make that work now. Okay, so here's a solution. So we have a user input which is being assigned to the variable search name, and then as before, we are iterating through the whole of the text file, 1 line at a time. Each time it iterates, it has stored this data into the variable line. and then we split out the data stored in line on the comma and assign it to these variables. Now that allows us to then compare the searched for name that's been entered by the user to the value currently assigned to this variable, and if they match, it will then run line 6. So if I run that and I enter Tilly, that outputs this data. If I run it again and output Amna, we can see this data. So what you've just learned comes up a lot in GCSE paper 2 scenarios where you have to read from a text file and then search through the data and then display certain results. And to help you practice this, I've got a really simple task for you that kind of mirrors what we've been doing. I've kept the text file really small because it might be that you just have to, if you're looking at this on the internet, you need to create a text file. So if you open up Notepad and save it as cars.txt and just add in some data here. So we've got the type of car, we've got the particular model of car, we've got the year or it was manufactured, and we've got the value of the car. Now, if you're in my school, you can download this from OneDrive, but if you don't have that available, you can literally just make this text file. So the challenges that you're being asked to work on with this data are: can you display all of the data? Can you search for and display the data for the most expensive car? And can you search by user input and display all of the cars of that brand? So if it searched for Audi, it would produce 2 search results. If it searched for Jaguar, it would produce 1 search result. Okay, so have a go at that and see how you get on. Okay, let's look at task 1, and the very first thing that we need to do is get access to that cars.txt file. And a common mistake that people make is they don't save their Thonny file into the same location that the cars.txt file is. So you need a folder for the text file, and you need to now save your Thonny file into the same folder. Okay, you can see here I've saved my py file into the same folder that I've got my cars.txt file in. So now we need to create a constant, and it could be my file or it could be cars. Let's call it cars, and we need to read the text file and assign it to this constant. Okay, so this is the instruction. So the file is in speech marks, then there's a comma, and then we've got R in speech marks, and that stands for read only. So we can, there are other formats, so read, write, and amend. We'll talk about write and amend another time. And a really good way to just check that is working is to enter this command. So you've got print, and then in brackets you've got the constant, and then you've got the .read lines command. Don't forget, it's not read line, it's read lines with an S at the end, and all of that's in brackets. And if we run that, you can see it is outputting everything that has been saved into the cars constant. So it's interesting to look at it this way because you can see the carriage returns, and you can see all of the data, and that just tells me that it has definitely been able to read that text file. So the first challenge was to display all of the data, and I guess this does achieve that, but you know, we could do it better. So let's look at a couple of other solutions. So we could use the .read line command without an S 3 times to display all 3 lines of data from this text file. Again, that's a pretty low tech solution. Can we do better? So this does the same thing, but it does it more elegantly in a for loop. So this is just a variable I've made up. There's no special command word here, but it's traditional to use the singular. So on each loop it will take a line from this constant and print it. So let's do that. So you can see here that it has output the information, but it's output the carriage returns, that \n that gets saved every time is a new line in the text file. So let's strip out that carriage return because that's what's causing these. Okay, so on each loop now, the car variable, which has got one line of the text file in it, is having the carriage return stripped out using .strip. So now when we run it, there are no gaps between it. So I think we can say we've achieved the first task to print all of the data, so let's move on. So the second task was to display the most expensive car. So we're going to need to add a few more variables and then compare those variables on each loop. So here you can see why it's really useful to use this command here, because unlike the previous task, we have more data that we need to assign to individual variables. So I've got brand, so that could be Audi, and model, so that's TT on the first loop. I've got the year 1999, and I've got the price, which is 3,400, and that will split each of these values on the comma. And we can just do a quick test to see if that's working properly. I've added a command inside the for loop, so it should print out the model of each on each loop. So it's output TT, A5 and XF. So this is the second column which has been assigned to model, so that is working. But the goal was to output the data for the most expensive car. So we now need to use the price value and compare on each loop to find out the highest value car and then print out that data. So you'll see I've now got a highest price variable I've declared, and the highest price is set to this integer 0, but that will update on every loop if the current car being looked at has a higher price than the one assigned to this variable. So we need an if statement for that. Now I've also got this where I want to store all of the details for the car that turns out to have the highest price. So on each loop it will now compare the current car's price on that loop with whatever has been saved in here. So on the first loop the value is set to 0, so 3,400 is higher than 0, so it will then save 3,400 into here. And then on the second loop it will say, well, 8,900 is higher than 3,400, so 8,900 gets saved into there. But on the third loop, that is less, so it will not update this variable on the third loop. Now what we need to do is, if this is updated, we also need to store all of the details for that car. So this should store all of the information in one row of this text file if the highest price has been updated. Now let's just test that to see if that works. So I'm going to just write a quick print statement to see if that works. So let's run this program. Okay, so we have a slight problem here. Remember before we had this before where it's trying to compare string with integer, and that is because when we split, even if it's a number value, it saves it, it assigns it as a string value. So we just need to cast it in. Okay, so before the if statement, we have now converted, we've cast the value for price that is currently stored as a string value, we've converted it to an integer and then resaved it into the same value, which means this will now work, hopefully. And then we can update the value for highest price. So let's run that. Okay, so looking at the text file, we can see that it is picking out the most expensive vehicle. So that suggests it is working, and it's also telling me that selected car has all of that vehicle's details stored in it. Now, what if we wanted to display selected car data with subheadings and things in it? So if we, for example, wanted to just show Audi, at the moment this isn't going to work because we've not split it. In fact, it's just showing the first record, the first letter. So update the value stored in this variable, splitting on the comma. So now if we print this variable, we should see it in the form of a list. And if I wanted to just show the first element in that list, that now works. And this allows us to display the information with text headings. So I think we can say we've achieved the second one now. We've displayed the most expensive car. So the third task was to search by user input and display all cars of that brand or that make. So going back to a simpler setup, I've got a variable here and a user input where the user can search for Audi or Jaguar. So we need the car.split so that we can assign on each loop the different values in the list to each of these variables. Now we can search by brand. And here we have an if statement that compares with the value assigned by user input with the value that has been split here, the brand, the make. And if it finds it, if these match, it will print out that. So if we search for Audi, we've got these two. If we search for Jaguar, we've got that one. Now, going back to Audi for a second, you can see there's this annoying gap. That's the carriage return that's caused that. So we can strip out the carriage return using the .strip command, so it will print it, but it will just take out that carriage return that is caused when this has an enter button has been pressed to create a new line. So if I run that, you can see when I search for Audi, there's no gap between these two. Okay, great. So hopefully that was useful. And the key here is using .split and .strip appropriately, opening and reading files, and then using for loops and creating variables so that we can manipulate each row of data depending on the question being asked. So well done. Let's move on.